You've decided you're ready to become a parent, and suddenly you're overwhelmed with people who feel they have the right to inform you on the correct way to conceive, give birth, what fears you should have, and the proper way to parent. How do you filter through the opinions? How do you know what's trustworthy information and what's a myth or just plain outdated? Welcome to the Birth Ease podcast. Join your host Michelle Smith and her guests as they cut through the noise and fear by sharing valuable tips, tools, and proven methods that help you connect with your own inner wisdom as you navigate the sacred journey that is pregnancy, birth, and parenthood in a more relaxed and confident manner. This podcast does not constitute, nor is it intended, as medical advice.
Hello, Birth Ease families. Welcome to this heartfelt space. I'm your host, Michelle Smith. I'm going to share an experience that I had because I feel it is very relevant to the conversation that is featured in this podcast episode. A year ago, last February, I attended the New Media Summit, which was held near Tampa, Florida. It's an event that allows someone who's interested in being featured as a guest on podcast to pitch themselves to prominent show hosts. Honestly, I only knew a little bit about podcasts, but I really felt I was being guided to go. The participants have less than 2 minutes to share their pitch, explaining why they feel they would be a good guest on someone's podcast and how what they have to offer could benefit the host community. The setup is similar to the television show The Voice, and 7 of the 40 featured podcast hosts, or icons of influence as they are referred to, sit on the stage with their backs to the person pitching as well as to the audience. If these podcasters or icons of influence feel moved by the pitch, then they will turn around in their chair to face the audience. The person pitching is facing the audience, so they have no idea if anyone has turned until their pitch is over. The participants are given feedback if they do not use up their entire allotted 2 minutes. If someone reaches 2 minutes, then they will be cut off and not receive any input on their pitch, and the input can be really helpful. Therefore, it's encouraged to create a pitch that is 90 seconds long. The participants are sorted by the first letter of their name, and you have no idea when the first letter of your name will be drawn. It's a very intimidating process, even for the most seasoned of speakers. As someone that's been a birth professional for 20 years, I wanted to convey exactly how imperative it is that the care and treatment that women, babies, and families receive during pregnancy and birth matters. We were given guidance regarding how to make a great pitch, and the most compelling ones shared a personal story. So I decided to speak about the birth trauma I experienced with the birth of my eldest child. And as I did that, I was met with another and even another layer of trauma being brought up as I struggled to make concise the obstetrical abuse my child and I experienced. I also sat with the obstetrical violence that I have witnessed over the years as a doula attending births, and the stories that my clients have shared with me as I've held space for them as we work to release and heal their trauma and pain. So after lots of revisions and many healing tears, this was my pitch on the behalf of myself, my children, and the families that I have served. Our bodies remember. During the birth of my last child, I sat rocking back and forth during the contractions, saying to myself aloud, "I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe." Triggered by the pressure I was feeling in my pelvis, my body was instantly transported back into the horrors that I experienced 22 years prior when my first child was ripped from my body with forceps. I was flashing back to the abuse and obstetrical violence my firstborn and I endured at the hands of my chosen obstetrician and the anesthesiologists that were entrusted to care for us. Shock and trauma that I had worked so hard to heal. Your body remembers. It will be heard. Disparities in birth and obstetrical abuse are still happening. Women are continuing to be patronized, bullied, and shamed. And we are conditioned to allow it. Because there is an underlying belief held by most that we women are to surrender our autonomy the very moment we become pregnant. And let's be clear, the impacts of that belief are deep and far-reaching. I am Michelle Smith. I have helped hundreds of women to understand their options in maternity care, transform their fears and stress, and connect with their inner calm as they bring their babies into the world. Because how your mother and you were treated at your most vulnerable moments matters. I ended up going over the 2-minute mark, even though I had practiced this pitch over and over again. And I'm very grateful to the couple of podcasters that made a stand for women and babies and featured me on their shows. Honestly, I didn't really expect to be a good fit for the vast majority of the shows. But what I was not expecting was the reaction in the room to be one of stillness and complete silence. Afterwards, it almost felt as if some people at the event would not even look at me. It was a really surreal experience. And honestly, I didn't even want to look at the pitch for a long time. I didn't watch it until July. But with much soul searching and conversations with people I trust, I discovered that I had touched upon a subject that many people are not ready to explore and shine a light upon. It just brings up too much shame and feelings of trauma and places where we may hold self-blame or even feelings like we failed. As you know, I now have my own podcast, and that's something I was not really expecting to happen so quickly after attending the New Media Summit. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity and for all of you that listen. And I'm also especially grateful and humbled that it has afforded me the opportunity to have on the show Cristen Pascucci. A former communication strategist at a top public affairs firm in Baltimore, Maryland, Cristen Pascucci is the founder of Birth Monopoly and Birth Monopoly's Doula Power Group, co-creator of the Exposing the Silence project, and from 2012 to 2016, vice president of the national advocacy organization Improving Birth. She has run an emergency hotline for women facing threats to their legal rights in childbirth, created a viral consumer campaign to break the silence on trauma and abuse in childbirth, and help put obstetric violence and the maternity care crisis in national media. Today, she is a leading voice for women giving birth, speaking around the country, and consulting privately for consumers and professionals on issues related to birth rights and options. Cristen is also the host of Birth Aloud Radio, as well as the executive producer of a documentary film planned for release in 2020 to start a national conversation on obstetrical violence, birth trauma, and women's rights in birth. As a note, due to the length of our conversation and the nature of the topic as well, this interview will be released in 2 episodes. And please, if the nature of this conversation is triggering for you, stop the podcast. You can return to it later if you feel led to, but take some deep breaths. Move and walk around, wash your hands and your face, take a shower, and call a trusted friend or caregiver if you need to. You can also listen to the meditation in episode 3. And you can even reach out to me or Susan, who was featured in episode 25 and 26 of the podcast. Our contact information, along with Kristen's, will be featured in the show notes. And please note that this interview was recorded a few weeks ago before hospital policies were changing so rapidly in response to COVID-19. As Cristen mentioned on her webpage, there are so many unknowns right now, and we are doing our best with limited information and resources. But things are changing quickly. We will need to remain flexible as more information comes out that helps guide our decision-making about birth settings and what safe means during an unprecedented public health crisis. So I appreciate that we are at a time in history that we have more ability than ever to connect and support each other, even while we are physically distant. We'll get through this together. Welcome, Cristen, to the Birthies podcast. I'm so excited and grateful to have you here.
Hey, Michelle. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So, as I was sharing in my introduction, a year ago, I had no idea as I did my New Media Summit pitch about how women, babies, and families are treated during birth matters, that I would have you here a year later. It's been a remarkable journey, so thank you.
Yeah. Well, I loved your pitch. And I remember when you first shared it in the Know Your Rights group. And I was like, this is wonderful. She has guts.
Yeah, because you got 2 minutes. You only got 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And I went right to the limit. So
yeah,
it was an interesting response
mm-hmm.
because everybody was really quiet about it. I don't think they knew what to do with it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's something that you've found in your work.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, can you share with the listeners what brought you to your work?
I didn't know anything about pregnancy or birth when I got pregnant. And throughout the course of my pregnancy, I learned everything I could possibly learn. And my initial plan was to have a scheduled cesarean.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the more I learned, the more I was like, I don't know, maybe there are other options that aren't horrible. And at some point, I realized in my research that the most undisturbed births actually seemed the least scary to me. And then I had this like sort of revelation that it was the maternity care that I was so scared of and not the actual birth itself.
That's significant.
Yeah. Well, we get our education from movies.
Right.
And that was what looked so horrifying. And also what I was hearing from my friends, with their birth stories was like and then they did this and then they did that. And I thought everything was fine, but then this happened and they put this in me and stretched this and blah, and I'm like, this sounds terrifying.
Right.
So sort of toward the end of my pregnancy, I started leaning more towards a more undisturbed, low intervention birth. So long story short, I sort of accidentally switched to a nurse midwife at a hospital from an OB towards the end of my pregnancy. And I had been crystal clear with this woman about what I wanted at the end. When I finally did figure what I wanted, I was like, this is it. So I have a communications background and I'm really confident in my ability to clearly convey to people what it is that I need and want. There was no ambiguity. It was just very clear.
Right.
So anyway, I did just start getting some sort of signs that maybe she wasn't as enthusiastic about it as she appeared at first. And then at the very end of my pregnancy, I was like 41 weeks and she started talking about induction.
Right.
And I was like, well, I don't understand. Don't I have till 42 weeks? And she's like, well, sort of, but we really like to kind of get the babies out after 41 weeks. We had this sort of week of really odd, uncomfortable interactions where I kept going in for testing. They kept trying to get me to put an induction date on the schedule. And I kept going, I literally don't understand why you need me to put a date on the calendar. I'm not going anywhere. If I get to 42 weeks and I need to be induced, I live 150 feet from your office. what is the rush? You know what I mean? Like, I just don't understand all the urgency and the weirdness.
And the scheduling. Yeah.
Like, this just is not a thing to be freaking out and stressing me out about so much. So without getting into all of the details, she called me on like 41 weeks and 6 days and said, I know that we talked about tomorrow, but we don't have room for you on our schedule tomorrow. So we need you to come in tonight and we need you to be induced. And I sort of reluctantly agreed, and then got off the phone and started panicking. I just really didn't feel, I was scared of the induction, first of all, and that I wasn't really offered any options around the induction. She did not want to strip my membranes, which I had requested, said I would, whatever. Just, it wasn't presented to me like, we're going to do this to make you comfortable. We're going to do this in a way that, like, here are some options around it. What would make you feel safest? What is appealing to you here? It was just sort of like, this is how we do it, and this is what we're going to do to you. And that, coupled with the lack of information about why I needed an induction, just made me really uncomfortable and feel really unsafe about the whole thing. You know, it just felt like someone trying to convince me to do something that they wanted me to do, that I could not get a clear answer as to why this was in my best interest or my baby's actual best interest. So on that day, I was able to find another nurse midwife at a different hospital who agreed to take me on as a client, which is, you know, really difficult to find. Providers do not like to take on people who have been seeing someone else for up until 41 weeks or whatever.
No, I have a new client that moved here from New York, and I think she was 24 to 26 weeks, and she couldn't find a provider, even though she had had prenatal care. She ended up going with a high-risk clinic with one of our local hospitals. There are a couple other practices that are far away from her, but I was shocked. No one would take her. No one wants to take anybody after 28 weeks, which I think is a problem. But that's another part of a discussion. It really is.
Well, and I didn't realize that at the time. I knew it was going to be tricky to find someone just because it was a Saturday. But I didn't realize that it was such a politically charged thing for me to switch in the first place and for a provider to actually take me that late. I had no idea. So I made the switch, and then I texted my first midwife and said, hey, I just am not in the right headspace to come in tonight. I'm just not going to be able to. And it kind of felt like ghosting someone that I was seeing and didn't like anymore. It was like, I had no intention of ever seeing her again at that point. I was just, I want you out of my life. And send you a text in like the nicest way possible, but I don't ever want to hear from you again. So I switched midwives and went into labor literally hours later and had my baby the next day with no complications and no issues and virtually no intervention. I went to my postpartum checkup, and I remember my midwife saying, kind of almost like shyly, this is the second, the new midwife, she said, you're kind of famous around here. Everybody's talking about you. And I was like, what do you mean? She said, well, I mean, people don't usually switch providers that late. And I was like, what do you mean they don't? Why wouldn't they? And, she sort of answered, but I was like, what does that mean? What a weird, that was such a strange interaction. I don't understand. So then when I left, I started sort of asking around, looking into it, and realized that my whole story was really unusual. And well, it was really normal up until the switching, and that was really fascinating to me to hear that it was really common for people to be told that they had to have a procedure done and not be given information about it. Really common for providers to treat women as if they owned their bodies, and really uncommon for people to ever switch away from that kind of care. And that was so weird to me. I was just like, I don't understand. If you hire someone to do a service for you and they suck at it, you fire them and you go find someone who does a good job. I don't understand how this could possibly be so unusual and so sort of like political.
It really is. And sometimes I found clients, if they saw their OB for GYN and then they're not happy
Right.
in their pregnancy care, they don't want to hurt their provider's feelings.
Yeah.
They get really uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
Or, oh, if I leave the practice, is there going to be backlash? And, sometimes providers won't transfer records. I had that recently happen to a mom.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, it's political. And then there's so many levels in there of, do I feel brave enough to make the switch? And can I find somebody to switch to?
Yeah, that was a big moment. So I didn't immediately switch to her. I saw her in her office. She examined me. We had a long conversation. And then I said, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to think about this. I left. And my friend had gone with me, and we were literally on the sidewalk outside. And I was texting my doula at the same time, which I didn't even really know what a doula was. I was just like, somebody who can help me with some things, I'll take it. And my friend was like, so why aren't you just switching to this person? And my doula was like, so did you want to switch to her then? And I was really like, oh, well, wouldn't that be sort of rude? It would really put her on the spot, because I'm sure she'll feel like she can't say no because I'm like right here and I'm pregnant and I need help.
Right.
And what do I tell my other midwife? We had this whole conversation about it. And ultimately, my friend, which it kills me that I can't remember the exact words that she used because I remembered for a long time, but she said something to me like, Cristen, are you more worried about whether or not this person likes you or what's best for your baby?
Mm.
And I was like, wow, when you put it that way, that really reframes this for me. And I remember standing there on that sidewalk thinking so hard and going, I do have to switch. Yeah, no, wait, this is the right thing. I do need to switch. And then saying out loud, you're right, I need to make this switch. And then I did it. But there was definitely like a whole thought process that happened over the course of a few minutes. And it was difficult, and I felt like, God, the weight of this decision of how do I tell the old one, and which I ended up doing with just that text of, sorry, I can't make it tonight.
Right.
So yeah, it was absolutely that obligation sort of feeling of, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and what is she going to think of me, and all of these things. And I'm just really glad that my friend was there to help me to reprioritize what was really important there, which was my actual birth, my baby, my own safety, my mental health. Because when you put it in those terms, I think it becomes really clear where your priorities should lie, and that your emotional discomfort with essentially someone else's emotional discomfort is less important than this really important life event that's about to transpire.
Right. It's a huge decision, I know. And I have women, sometimes they just agonize over it. And then sometimes they switch and sometimes they don't. Often it's hard when they knew that they really wanted to switch and they were too afraid to do it. And then their birth turns out
exactly like
we were afraid it was going to, right?
Yeah.
They are very loyal to their midwife or their OB.
Mm-hmm.
And they often forget that if it's a practice with 19 different doctors or 5 different midwives, they may not even get your physician or your midwife anyway.
You're likely to not even get them. Right.
Right. And are the policies that your midwife or doctor that they are willing to do with you, are the rest of the providers in the practice willing to do that? Because often they're not.
Yeah. Oh, totally. That was another thing that sort of blew my mind when I realized, and this was actually one of the red flags for me with this person, was we had initially talked about who would actually be there for the birth. I think maybe my doula clued me in that was a thing.
Right.
So I had said, listen, it's really important to me that you are there. I have the relationship with you. You know what I want. I want you there. She was like, absolutely, it'll be me. No question. A couple appointments later, it was, well, it'll definitely be me unless it's on a weekend. Then it might be me or one of 2 other people. I was like, well, okay, like less comfortable with that, but it seems like odds are in my favor. And then it was like it changed a third time. And I was like, okay, listen, I am totally clear that we already had this conversation and the answer was different. I know that I am not crazy and I can understand adult conversation. And that was one of the things that was really alarming me, was that the answer was changing. And it felt like she wasn't being straightforward with me from the beginning. And that made me really uncomfortable. You know, I really like to talk about it in terms of boyfriends. It felt so similar, which is really interesting to me. When you really like someone, you have chemistry with them, and yet, you know, there are these red flags. And you choose whether or not to pay attention to those red flags, or to give them the benefit of the doubt, or to just pretend like you don't see them. And I am so grateful that I had a couple of people there in the like sort of decision moments that were able to go, remember those red flags though? And let's re-examine your priorities. Because it was very, very easy to ignore the red flags and to remember the good things. It's like, yeah, but remember we had that wonderful vacation together?
Right.
And for me, it was like, oh, but remember that first appointment? She was so wonderful. And I remember just feeling so safe with her and so understood and heard. And, you know, we were on the same page. That was, in retrospect, it was a big growth moment for me to really make a difficult decision. That was, I'm not going to prioritize this person's feelings over what my gut is telling me about the safety of the care that I'm going to receive. And I'm using the word safety in a really comprehensive way there, because our emotional and mental safety and health are absolutely critical in birth, which just reminds me of so many of my friends saying things like, you know, I really like my provider. She's very blunt. She's very straightforward. She doesn't mess around. She doesn't try to couch anything. And what I'm hearing is, you mean she doesn't care about your feelings. So that's great that someone's being honest. But in reality, when I dig into those kinds of conversations, I'm hearing, oh, no, what it is she doesn't mind scaring you, which is different from just being honest with you. Because a lot of the time, not minding scaring pregnant people is to steer them in a direction.
Right.
Or it is an expression of how you view pregnancy, birth, and your patient, which is a ticking time bomb.
Right.
And when you view it that way and you treat patients that way, that literally is what it becomes. And I didn't know any of this at the time, but again, I'm just really grateful that things just kind of fell into place for me, so that I got to the place where I really dodged a bullet. And I was able to get a taste of what so many people experience without actually having the trauma of an induction that I didn't fully consent to and wasn't really informed about, and whatever complications could have resulted from that. So after that, I started doing a whole bunch of research. Now I wasn't looking so much at what pregnancy and birth were, but why is it normal that people are treated like this? I'm so confused. I'm an educated, intelligent, accomplished adult, and they treated me like it was the 1950s, and they just would pat me on the head and be like, sweetie, just, you know, just you don't need to ask questions. We'll take care of it. Don't worry about it. And then when I did ask questions, it was like, sweetie, don't ask questions. Stop. Now it's getting weird that you're asking questions, you know?
Right.
So that was just bizarre to me. I was like, I didn't know that there was any place in 21st century United States of America where this was normal social behavior to treat women this way. So that became sort of an obsession. And from there, I got involved in advocacy. I met up with Rebecca Decker, who's the founder of Evidence-Based Birth, and she lives really close to me. And we met socially and had our babies almost at the same time. And they were little blonde boys named Henry. We got to be friends and ended up getting into advocacy together and became the first board members at Improving Birth and hosting these national rallies where parents came out and sort of protested or rallied around how we need to improve maternity care all around the country. And then I started talking to a lot of birth lawyers because I was really curious about what our rights were in these situations. What do you do when you think the care you're receiving is harmful or dangerous or not in your best interest? Do you have to listen to the doctor? Do you have to do what they say? Do you have to follow the hospital policy that says you're not allowed to be pregnant after 41 weeks? So I started exploring those things. Again, was shocked that I could not just easily Google them and couldn't just find straightforward answers. I almost started like an intensive education at that point with these birth lawyers. And we started a hotline for pregnant people so they could immediately contact us if they were facing sort of a situation like I had been facing of you have to come in tonight or you're in trouble.
Right.
You have to have this induction or this cesarean or whatever it was. So that was the beginning.
It's huge. It's such important work. As someone that experienced birth trauma, especially with my first, I was so drawn to your work because we need to understand our rights in childbirth and even to look at as doulas, as women, pregnant persons giving birth, really, how do we navigate this? And what are our rights? What do we have to agree to? I had a mom once years ago that she had moved from California and she was going to go to 42 weeks and her doctor wanted to induce her at 40 weeks. And we spent a long time writing this letter and she emailed it to him and he brought it into the visit and basically told her she had to be induced. And she said she didn't want to be. And he dismissed her from the practice without even checking on the baby or anything like that. And her mother was with her and really was very upset. She's like, you haven't even seen my daughter. You haven't checked on my grandchild.
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to do? And so he gave her the number for the high-risk clinic. And then the head of that department was really his amazing man. And she went on a couple of days later and had this wonderful, amazing, unmedicated birth. But it really emphasized, how do we navigate this?
Mm-hmm. Wow, what a question. I think that it's funny to me because even now, like 8 years later, the thing that strikes me is the same thing that struck me 6 weeks postpartum, which was that women are willing to submit.
Mm-hmm.
There's a cultural and societal expectation that you will do what you're told. And I've looked at this obviously through the lens of rights for a long time. But what I find so fascinating is there are a small group of people who are totally willing to stand on their rights. And then there's the majority of women who feel very uncomfortable.
Right.
Even if they do have the right, and they do, saying no and have a really, really hard time with that and aren't willing to or aren't able to stick to that no. So in sort of like a conversation like you were saying where the doctor says, well, but you have to be induced. And she says, but I don't want to be. And the doctor says, but you have to be. And then the pregnant person says, but I really don't want to be. And the doctor says, I know, but you really have to be. And then usually what happens is the pregnant person says, well, I mean, I guess if I have to be, which is what I did, right?
Right.
When someone argues with you enough, you eventually, even if they aren't good reasons or any reasons at all, you eventually go, well, I guess then I have to be, as opposed to, I have a no and I mean my no. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to tie me down and induce me? I said no. You need to make a new plan, not me. That's really difficult for a lot of people. And I hear the feedback from doulas and birthing people all over the country of, I had to, or they made me. And it's so interesting to me because, believe me, I 100% understand why you would say that. I've been there. I've done the same thing of feeling like I have to do it. I'm doing this, but I don't want to do it. When really I did capitulate. If I or any person really says no, what then would be required would be an assault of your person. So when you get to that, I'm saying no and they're saying, but you have to stick to your no. You really have to have that boundary around your person and feel and have the agency around it. It's so interesting to me because I see so many parallels with other kinds of assault. And there are many reasons for that. But one of the things that ties them together, like sexual assault and assault in birth, is consent, the idea of consent. And what is consent and what does it mean? And affirmative consent versus the kind of consent where someone wears you down, or they pressure you, or they threaten you, or they intimidate you, or they emotionally coerce you, where you technically said yes, but it wasn't really a yes. It was I'm going to give in to all of your pressure.
Right.
Yeah, so that's not true consent. But unfortunately, and I'm tying that into birth and sex, where I would say you're sort of taken advantage of. To me, that is a case of someone using their power to override or overwhelm your resistance. And the unfortunate truth is, even if that's the case, you're the one who's stuck with the consequences of that.
Right.
They're not going home and losing sleep over it.
Right. A lot of my fellow birth workers will say they pull the dead baby card.
Right. Mm-hmm.
If you do this, your baby could die.
Right.
No mom wants to hear that. No parent wants to hear that. Most pregnant people do whatever they have to do for their baby. And sometimes that may be the case, that there is something going on with their baby, but often
not as often
may
as
not be.
they are told.
Right, right.
And it's like there's an additional layer to that, because the definition of birth trauma includes a real or perceived threat to the safety or life of your baby.
Right.
If we look at that as the definition or part of the definition, the core of the definition of birth trauma, then what you realize is the provider is actually introducing birth trauma into the equation.
Yes. Yes.
So maybe there is a real threat, but often it is a perceived threat, or it isn't a real threat at all. It is an emotional coercion that's happening. So in that moment, what is a person's trauma response? Your pregnant person or client is in a trauma state, has been put into, literally had birth trauma placed on them actively by another person. And now you're dealing with someone who is in, most likely, a trauma state and is having a trauma response.
Right.
So this is like a whole other layer to all of it,
Right.
where your brain literally operates differently at that point. It's not a rational response. Most people will not have the wherewithal to say, okay, so you're saying my baby might die. Can you break down those risks for me? What is the risk of stillbirth from 40 weeks, 0 days to 41 weeks, 0 days? What's the difference in those rates?
Right.
Few people will really have that ability to overcome that emotional traumatic moment.
Right.
And will often capitulate. And so there's a real power dynamic that enters into all of it, which is why it's so important to be with someone as a provider who isn't there to exert their power over you, or this isn't any kind of a control thing or a power trip for them, but genuinely sees you as the decision maker and the center of the care. And that was what I found with my second provider, my second midwife who I switched to. And it was really clear from my interactions with her. It felt very different, even though I really liked the other one.
Right.
Like I really did like and get along with and appreciate my other provider. I didn't know what I was missing until I met someone who treated me with the utmost respect. And then I knew what it was supposed to feel like.
Right. Right. I'm sitting with those words because it's so true. Sometimes it takes, sadly, a few births to realize this isn't what I want. And I didn't know I had options. I didn't know that I could be treated respectfully.
Mhm.
You don't even know what to ask for,
Right.
especially when I gave birth to my daughter will be 34. It was just, this is what you do and this is how it is.
Yeah.
Completely,
Yeah.
completely different. And I've really sat with women were able to vote in America 100 years ago, only 100 years ago. So is it surprising that our autonomy in birth has not been present?
Yeah, no, it's not surprising at all. And another example, like what you said, is the fact that marital rape was legal
Right.
in some states right up until, are you ready? 1990s,
Wow.
1980s, 1990s.
Wow.
So just to think about that, that is how, not backwards, but how behind the times we are in so many ways, that there's that perception that in some situations your consent doesn't matter.
Right.
As a woman, when it comes to sex and reproduction, there are some situations where you no longer own your body. Someone else has the authority over your body. That's really powerful. And that's what continually surprises me, that people don't get more upset about it.
Right.
In the realm of childbirth, that really that people aren't taking to the streets to say, my basic civil rights are not only violated as an individual, but widely disrespected in policy and practice all across the country in hundreds of facilities.
Right.
That's, I think, a really big deal.
Right. And it was part of what I said in that pitch, that the moment we become pregnant, we are expected to surrender our autonomy. The very moment we become pregnant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's just this underlying belief.
It's like your brain is removed from the equation. You're just like a body now. It's let us do the thinking for you.
Yes.
You're pregnant. It's too dangerous for you to think for yourself and make decisions for yourself. Now you're a body with a baby in it, and we are going to keep you safe. So you need to do what we say. And I picked up those themes, throughout pregnancy and throughout my maternity care experiences, and was really shocked, and never ever had identified as a feminist before any of it. And over the next few years was just like, oh my God, I had no idea, growing up the way that I did, that feminism is important. That feminism means something.
Right. Well, in the interview I did with Kathy Tagadine, I was saying, I feel like I'm more of a soother. And she said, no, there really is a bit of a birth warrior in you. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. I'm really stepping into that because it gets hard to see women mistreated. Women, one birth, as we've been talking, is sticking out in my mind where the mom was being induced, and it was a legitimate reason. And the previous OB had been very patient. The midwife had been patient. She was still 3 centimeters. And another OB came in, and I don't even think he really asked permission to check her. He just, we're going to check you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the man, this is going to be so graphic the way I'm describing it, but the man did not even have his fingers out of her vagina before he said, we're done. We're doing a C-section, because she was still 3 centimeters. And this is a woman that has a history of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Not to check her and say, and gently, step back, cover her up, ask permission to check her.
Yeah.
And say,
let's talk.
Okay, let's talk. Let's talk. I know this was so important to you. And here's my concerns. You're still 3 centimeters. It was horrifying.
what you're describing is just no humanization in that whatsoever.
No.
It's like, you're my job to do, and I'm doing it. You, as a person, don't matter here.
Right. My authority does. And I was there as a doula. And then the person that trained me as a doula, Kathy Bradley, was there. And she's very prominent in the hospital there.
Uh-huh.
And he had seen her. And I kind of wonder if he felt his authority was going to be usurped. Because my brain, this was years and years ago, and my brain is still wrapping around. Who says that kind of thing without even removing your fingers from her most intimate parts of her body?
Yeah.
We're done.
I just imagine like how sexually violating that could feel to someone. It really makes me cringe when you were telling that story. Like, I was putting myself in her stirrups, and like how horribly dehumanizing and violating it would feel for anyone to insert something in my body and then objectify me. Would really feel sexually violating and sexually traumatizing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. The second half of our conversation will be featured in next week's episode. And please remember, there is support out there for you. I am offering virtual sessions, and my Birthies Method Childbirth Education course is available online with video chat sessions, and it includes instruction on the creating of a relaxation habit, something I feel we all really need right now. And it also includes the audio recordings to practice with. I will also be offering a complimentary mini course. Please remember to check out Kristen's page for resources as well as evidence-based birth. Many prayers and much love to you all. We will get through all of this together.
For more great conversations like these, or to find out more information and access Michelle's library of amazing guests, go to birthiesservices.com/podcast. For more information on the Birthies Method, Michelle's classes, meditations, and other services, go to birthiesservices.com.